Our program today highlights the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum and is being presented by the Holocaust Museum's Manager of Volunteer and Visitor Services, Ms. Haley Stoddard, and the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, Dr. Evelyn Becker-Meyer. Haley received her bachelor's degree in History and Classics from Bucknell University and her master's degree in Public History with a focus on museum studies from the University of West Georgia. She has been working in museums and historic sites for over 5 years, serving as a volunteer, intern, and staff member. With experience in children's museums, art museums, historic houses, and history museums, Haley has honed her skills as a museum educator and joined the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum team in May 2022. I know you're going to talk about this, but was that about when the renovation and new museum opened, or?
Very close to it, yes.
Okay, so she's been there. If you're not familiar, they did a great job there, and it's definitely a sight to see. Dr. Evelyn Becker-Meyer received her master's degree from Washington University in St. Louis and her Doctor of Pharmacy from University of Health and Pharmacy. Is that correct now?
Health Sciences.
Health Sciences and Pharmacy, I should know that. Formerly known as St. Louis College of Pharmacy. It's still a pharmacy school, but they do a lot more than that also. She retired from the College of Pharmacy after teaching biology for 46 years. Great gift that she's given to lots of people. As a daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, her interest in sharing survivor stories has been longstanding. She has been volunteering as a museum educator at the St. Louis Holocaust Museum since 2018. Today's program will be an account of Holocaust survivors as told by their daughter and granddaughter. You will also learn about the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum, a museum that has been a trusted resource in St. Louis and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Haley and Evan.
Hello everyone, thank you all so much for having us. Before I do begin, I do want to thank Beth, Debbie, and Dina for inviting myself and Evelyn here today, as well as all the people who made this wonderful program possible. So thank you all so much for having us. As she mentioned, my name is Haley Stoddard. I am the Manager of Volunteers and Visitor Services for the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. Now, before I talk about the museum as it stands today, I feel that I must mention and recognize the wonderful legacy of the museum. So in the 90s, our community had a vision, and that vision was to share their history, which blossomed into a wonderful museum, the St. Louis Holocaust Museum and Learning Center, as you see here. It began in 1995 when a community of survivors wanted to be able to showcase both their community and their story. I do want to mention a few key founders, those being Thomas Green, Leo Wolf, William Kahn, and Rabbi Robert Sternberg, who part of this wonderful community, as you can see, built one of the only 22 Holocaust museums of significant size in the country here in St. Louis. Their programs explored many contemporary aspects of both American life, citizenship, democracy, and a variety of other aspects, all through the lens of the Holocaust. What started as a department of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis has now today blossomed into its own independent nonprofit institution, the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum, which, as mentioned, has just recently reopened on November 2nd of 2022. Now, I joined the team just a little earlier in May of that year, when the museum looked a little bit like this. So when I came onto the team, the outside structure was fully built, the parking lot looked wonderful, the inside was still having some final touches, and the day the grass was laid down was a wonderful sight to see. But it was a very important moment for myself, and one that I want to share case with you all today. So I do want to show you what the inside became a little bit here. So here is a floor plan of the museum itself. Now, like many Holocaust museums, the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum does go through that traditional historic chronology, which spans all the way here, along the bottom, starting a little bit before the timeline, continuing on through the main narrative, and then finally coming to a close just shortly after the end of the war and the Holocaust. But I hope you'll notice here in the center of our floor plan, where it looks a little bit like a grid structure, is where we take a pause in the historic overview. And this is a section of the museum where we focus on the choices, decisions, and an area we call perspectives and roles of what people chose to do during this time frame. What roles they took on, whether this be a bystander, a collaborator, a rescuer, or a resistor. But one of the main functions of this space is not only to recognize the decisions people made then, but to reflect on the decisions that we as individuals make today. How do we affect the lives of those around us when we see also bias or injustice or stereotyping, as was happening during this time frame of the Holocaust? Now the museum then kicks back into the timeline where we talk about the end of the war, and finally ends in the top section that you'll see over there with an area called The Power of Testimony, St. Louis Survivor Speaks. Now the essence of this section I will continue to talk about in just a moment here. Here we have, of course, the mission and the vision of the museum. Now our mission is to use the history and lessons of the Holocaust to reject hatred, promote understanding, and inspire change. We envision a transformative Holocaust experience that fosters empathy and empowers our visitors to take action against bigotry. Now my job is essentially to put this mission into motion. As the manager of volunteers and visitor services, I not only oversee our wonderful volunteer family, who was very kind to welcome me when I joined here in May. I also, of course, help with overseeing the daily operations and visitor services. But one of the main components of my job is to work with school groups, community organizations, churches, synagogues, families, general visitors who want to come in and explore this museum, who hope to make an experience that makes them have a connection with the past and their present. And whether that is inside the walls of the building or outside, where I get to meet all of your lovely selves as well, that is what part of my position is. So to give you another closer look inside here, I want to show you just two central spaces here within the museum. So the photo that you see over here on the left-hand side is in an area called the Gathering Storm. It's a section of the museum where we essentially focus on the rise of Nazism following the start, or the end, of World War I. It's in this section, as you can see on the back wall, with those tiny little squares. Those little squares are all propaganda images. It's an interactive where folks can engage and see those images, but yet turn them and actually talk about what they're trying to portray. It starts with those aspects right here, where it's through a systematic series of actions and legal reforms that we talk about how the Holocaust came to pass. The image over here on the right-hand side showcases that section of perspectives and roles. It's there that we really challenge this idea of what perception and or position does an individual take when they're confronted with certain things in life. Our museum serves as a witness to the past, but also as an investment in the future through both education and awareness. Part of that future engagement is going to be with our Innovative Impact Lab. Now this is an experience, unfortunately, that is not open as of yet, but one we are very excited to pull upon. As you'll notice here, the Impact Lab's goal is essentially to take those lessons of the Holocaust and put them into the aspects of our lives today. It's one thing to have a visitor go through the entire museum and then leave and say, you've seen this horrible history, now go out into the world and do wonderful things. That's a pretty big message for a 12-year-old or a 62-year-old. How does one actually go out in the world and do these things? What are the steps one can take to actually make effective change? And that's what we hope the Impact Lab will become. When you can see it here, from an aerial point of view here, it is actually split into the three sections of our mission, with one section focusing on rejecting hatred and taking a deep dive into the aspects of genocide or hate crimes. The other becoming a promoting of understanding, where we talk about the spiral of hate. How does something as small as a bias get all the way down to something as dangerous as violence and genocide? And finally, we have Inspire Change, which provide real-life examples of how to go from being a bystander to an active ally, to being supportive of those around you and your community. What I don't want to forget, of course, is the key aspect of our institution as well, which is our library, archives, and research area. We, of course, are here to hold and honor and showcase and respect a very long history. And we have to do so by honoring and respecting the artifacts which showcase that aspect. Now, the other final piece of my position today is bringing us back to that end section here of the exhibition, our St. Louis Survivor Speaks section. Survivors are the heart of our museum. We would not be here without them. And we continue to honor them in every way possible. As you can see in this section here, there are a variety of photos that showcase not only survivors, but their families as well, the lives that they created in St. Louis, Missouri. We have 2 video screens, one in the front here and the one you can see just a portion of it there in the back. Those showcase 8 video testimonies of survivors who still get to share their story with the public each and every day. What is not seen in this photo is that on the opposite wall is a list of all of the survivors who we know of that made their way to St. Louis. To our understanding, there were over 800 survivors that made their way to St. Louis at one point. Every single day, their name is on that wall so that they are never forgotten and that they are always honored. Their lives, their stories, their testimonies are continuously honored by our speakers, one of which I have the privilege to introduce next. So if everyone would please give me a nice round of applause as we welcome Ms. Evelyn Becker into the stage.
Good afternoon. I'm privileged to be here, and I'm here to tell you my family story, but I'm going to tie it in with overall what we try to do and teach particularly our young students when they come to the museum. So, both of my grandparents, I should say my grandmothers, were able to escape along with my parents. And this is the story of my maternal grandmother's family, and they were named Gombrich. And as it said on the previous slide, it's a story of exodus and survival. So it's different because my parents were never in a camp. But as I think most of the people in this room know, going to a strange country where you don't speak the language, you don't have a job, and you don't know anybody is also a very, very difficult journey. So this is my parents' journey. So my grandmother's family is from a town, fairly large city I would call it, called Münster in Germany, and she was one of 13 children. And she was the oldest, and as often was the case in those years, especially if the oldest was a girl, she helped take care of all the other children, right? And so this is only a part of the family. We think that of this very large family, 26 people were murdered by the Nazis. But the rest of them were able to get out, which is a pretty amazing percentage. And the interesting thing that I found myself asking myself was how come that happened? And from what I can tell, it was because they were willing to leave early. You know, they didn't have a lot of wealth. It just made good sense for them to get out. And the second, and perhaps the most important part, is they survived because of the incredible goodness of others. Because even if you were willing to leave, nobody wanted the Jews. It was very difficult to get out. And so you'll be hearing some of that and seeing some of the documentation. So this is my grandmother and my grandfather. They married in 1905. My grandfather was considerably older than my grandmother. Her name was Frida, and they settled in his hometown, a town called Hohenlimburg in Westphalia in Germany. He owned a dry goods store. Now, how many people in this room know what that is? Okay, see, this doesn't happen with the youngsters. No clue what a dry goods store is. They probably think it's towels, something like that. And it's very common even to this day in Europe. The store was on the lower level, and the family lived in an apartment above. My grandfather died in 1916. My mother was the oldest of their 3 children, and she was only 10 at that time. So there were 2 girls, and then the youngest was a boy, and he was only 3. So my grandmother was a widow at a very early age, and she had 3 children and no means of support. So she ended up having to sell the store, and she moved to a very, very tiny little town. So this is my mother. The big bows were the courtesy of the dry goods store. My mother, my Aunt Edith, for whom I'm named, and my uncle Rudolph. That picture was taken in 1917, the year after their dad died. Not a happy time for them, as you can imagine. This is a picture of that town. It was on a river. And I visited, I've been to Germany several times. I visited the town, and I actually was able to find the house that my mother and her siblings were born in. Today, the store at the bottom is a wool studio, in other words, a yarn store. Not that different from dry goods. And the apartment and the building are still there, because I knew what the address was, and it's not a huge town, so I was able to find it. That was pretty cool. So after my grandfather died, as I said, they moved to this small town. My mother was the oldest. At the age of 14, she was pulled out of school and sent to work to support the family. My grandmother had a little farm. They had chickens and grew vegetables and things like that. These were very, very difficult times for a number of different reasons. After the Treaty of Versailles ended World War I, inflation in Germany was literally, when I say unbelievable. At the museum, we have a bill from the Weimar Republic at the time. It says it is a 1,000,000 mark, which was the currency. It's about 4 marks to the dollar. A 1,000,000 mark bill. Can you imagine? I mean, even high school students can't imagine. My mother told me that she paid 3 million marks to buy a bicycle to get to and from work. I mean, we're paying $5 for a dozen eggs. This is much, much worse than that. They had to cash their checks immediately after they were paid and go out and buy groceries. And the next day, they could buy far fewer groceries. It was a really, really difficult time. My grandmother suffered enormously. Her middle child, my Aunt Edith, died when she was 12 years old. And my grandmother always said that was the hardest thing that she ever experienced. And she experienced so many difficult things. My uncle, when he was older, was sent to study horticulture in Holland, which turned out to be very fortuitous for him, because he was there when Hitler came to power, and he was hidden there during the war. And subsequently, he ended up going to Argentina. So this is my mother and her brother. You can see I got the short jeans from my mom. And, when my mother passed away, I found all kinds of interesting things. It's interesting when you think about what people brought out from the Holocaust. Photographs. My mother brought her report cards. Just amazing. I know that she very much resented that she never got to go get formal education. And this is the town where she worked. She worked as a clerk in the town office, and she conveniently circled the windows so we would know where she worked. So when my mother got older, she moved to a larger town. She trained to be a bookkeeper, and she was a secretary there. She worked for a furniture company. And it turned out, now we get to my dad's side of the story, my father's family was in Nuremberg, which, as you probably know, was a hotbed of Nazism. And that was the first place where the Nazis began confiscating Jewish businesses. My father's family, my father was also the oldest in his family, also 3 children. They confiscated their business, and so my father had no means of employment. So he went to work as a furniture salesman, a traveling salesman. And he traveled to the furniture company where my mother worked, and that's how they met. They became engaged, and by now we're in the 1930s, and the Nazis, have come to power, and things are getting worse and worse and worse. My father's sister had gotten married and emigrated to the United States, and she was able to get papers for him to come. So a little bit about getting papers. First of all, you had to get a visa, right? There was a quota system. So one of the reasons that many people who wanted to leave Germany but couldn't get out was because their number didn't come up. For some people, their number came up, they were already in Auschwitz. my father left Germany and came to the United States in 1937, and because his sister was here, she was able to find a sponsor. So you needed to have your number come up, you needed to have a visa. Then you had to find sponsors. So sponsors were people who were willing to put up money that would be used by the United States government if you became a ward of the state. So remember, this is the 1930s. Most people in Germany didn't know people in other countries, let alone people who would put up money. And so, because my father's sister was here, she was able to find a sponsor for him. He came to the US. He worked for a year to get enough money to send my mother a ticket to come, because that was the next thing you had to have, a ticket. And was able to find a sponsor for her. So, additionally, in order to leave Germany, even after you had your visa, you had your boat ticket, and you had your sponsor to get into the other country, you still had to get permission to leave Germany. And that was not always easy. And when my mother passed away, I found all of this paperwork, including affidavits that she apparently had to provide from her landlord that said she paid her rent on time, from her boss, who said that she was a good worker, she showed up to work on time, she was honest, etc. So all these barriers were put in front of people. And at the museum, we have some recordings of various different families and the obstacles they encountered when they tried to get out. Some of them were unsuccessful in getting out. But the more money you had, the more barriers the Nazis put up, right? And we can all imagine where the money went. So this is some of the paperwork. And a couple of interesting things I want to point out. When I said that I'm here today because of the goodness, incredible goodness of total strangers, the person who provided this paperwork for my mother had never even met her. And he really didn't even know my dad. So you look at the top and you'll see it says, my relative, because usually sponsors are relatives, right? You see that's crossed out and it says friend, right? And that's my mother's name, Charlotte Stern. And he has it signed at the bottom. He was a physician, and you notice he had to prove how much money he had in the bank, how much money he earned. That'll tickle most of the people in this audience. $600 in the bank and $50 a week. About what doctors earn now, right? And personal property, and then my father had to provide paperwork. He worked, of course, whatever he possibly could work at. He worked in a restaurant, not serving people, but washing dishes, you know, but just to make enough money, $25 a week. Then you had to have all these materials for the shipping line that took you. Now, when my mother came out, she was still able to take goods. They couldn't bring out money, but they could bring things. And those things are what actually connected me to the Holocaust Museum here, because I'm not sure that my kids will want those things, and I wanted to be sure that they were saved. And so some of those items I brought to the Holocaust Museum so that they would be in a place where they could be used to teach generations. So now my mother is in Germany, is in the United States. My grandmother is still in this small town. And in some ways, I think that's what saved her, because she was there during Kristallnacht, but there was no synagogue in this town. And it was a small town, and I think they, you know, the Nazis just never came to that town. The rest, I don't really know that much about, because even though I shared a bedroom with my grandmother for 18 years, she never talked about this. What she did tell me about, which in some ways is very ironic, was how beautiful Germany was. You know, a lot of the German Jews thought of themselves as Germans first and Jews second. And for this they were murdered because, yeah. So my mother was absolutely desperate to get my grandmother out. As time went on, of course, so in 1939, in September 1st, Germany, of course, invaded Poland. That started World War II. After that, there were no more ships leaving German ports. So you had to come out somehow else, which meant that you had to get through another country, right? But here was the kicker. right after Poland, in rapid succession, right, Hitler invaded Holland, Belgium, and France. So my grandmother ultimately left Europe from Spain. So that meant she had to get through France to get to Spain. And I'll show you her, I'm going to use the word passport, but it's not really a passport because Hitler stripped Jews of their citizenship. So it was I'll show you in a minute what those look like. I think that the only way she could have gotten to Spain was through France, and I'm guessing the underground, the French resistance must have helped. I know that she lived for a while because she missed the boat she had a ticket for in the Basque Country. So again, total strangers took care of her. Ultimately, she sailed from the port of Vigo, Spain, from there to Cuba. There was typhus on the boat. When the boat came to New York, it was quarantined, but eventually she got onto land and was reunited with her daughter. My grandmother arrived in September of 1941. By December, of course, December 7th in particular, that was it. Nobody got out after that. Well, very few people got out. So this is my grandmother's. A Reise pass literally means a travel pass, so it ain't a passport. I'm sure you recognize the Deutsches Reich. That's my grandmother's picture. The Germans are very enamored of stamps. And this, of course, is the famous thing that we all know is on there, right? The J, to identify, to shame Jews. And another interesting thing that maybe you don't know is that on all official documents that the Jews had to carry, women had to adopt the middle name of Sarah, and men had to adopt the middle name of Israel. So you'll see on there it says Friederike, which is the long German term for Frida, Sarah, Stern. The other interesting thing on the other page is the stamps of the border police, and you'll see that there is a stamp from the German border police, and there's a stamp from the Spanish border police. Nothing from France. That's why I'm assuming that she was taken through France without official knowledge. And then this is the happily ever after part. This is my grandmother, my mother, I'm the cute one. And to make matters worse, I'm spoiled only, because my mother was 40 when I was born, so they waited a long time, which I can completely understand after what they've been through. So that is my grandmother's story, and I was blessed to, spend every night with her. And I'll just briefly tell you that when I was a child, we shared a bedroom, and many a night she would get up, and I would hear her, and she would be very, very agitated. Now, today, we would call that a panic attack. And I would get up and I would walk the floors with her until she calmed down. And now, today, I look back and I say, she had PTSD. So my uncle, whose story I don't know very much about, was hidden in Holland during the war. He and his wife emigrated to Argentina. They had a child, and they subsequently came to the United States. So my grandmother got to be reunited with them as well. So now I want to tell you about my grandmother's family, her siblings, right? There were 4 girls, and I call them the Gumprich girls. So you probably know that Hitler thought women were good for a few things. Kinder, children, Kirche, church, Küche, kitchen. That's what women were good for, right? That was their role in life, not in this family. So the oldest of my grandmother's sisters was my Aunt Selma, and she married a rabbi. And together they managed an orphanage in Berlin. After Hitler came to power, they found safety, I should say, or created a safe haven for the children of Jews who knew they probably couldn't save their kids. So they just gave them to the orphanage with hopes for the best. Now, I've researched this some, and I know that they did it. They actually were able to save a pretty nice number, not a huge number, of children some of them on the kinder transports. A number of them were adopted by Quaker families here in the United States. The Nazis, of course, closed the orphanage, and my Aunt Selma and her husband had 2 boys, both of whom became rabbis. One of them, the older one, was in the United States studying in rabbinical school. He was able to get his parents out. He finished rabbinical school here, and he enlisted in the United States Army, and he was among the soldiers who liberated one of the concentration camps. So the cool thing about my Aunt Selma was that they ultimately settled in Toronto, and I was fortunate enough to be a part of her 100th birthday. Not only did she celebrate her 100th birthday, but she celebrated getting her bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto. Isn't that marvelous? And she lived to be 103. Or at least be afraid of us, right? That's my Aunt Selma and her sister, my Aunt Alice. And this is from a book about Germany that depicts this orphanage, and her husband, Rabbi Gunther Cloud's name is on there as well. So my Aunt Alice also took a different route. She decided to get a PhD in chemistry. Now this was in the 1920s, not a very common thing, right, for women to do, but she did. She married a judge, and almost immediately after Hitler came to power, Jews were forbidden to be a part of the legal system. And so she and her husband immigrated to South Africa, where he continued in the judiciary. They had a child, and well, actually, I think the child was already born in Germany. And my Aunt Alice opened a perfume factory in South Africa. Now, she did come to visit a couple of times, and then after her husband passed away, she moved to the United States. So I, again, was blessed to be able to spend some time with her. And the youngest sister, I didn't really know very well. I think I only met her once or twice. She immigrated to Palestine. So one of the things that I kind of want to point out is you have to be willing to go wherever you could possibly go, literally to save your life. And they all went to different places. I mean, my family went all over the world to get out. So I'm just going to tell you about 2 of the boys, because it seems only fair. One of whom, these were actually her brothers that I actually knew. I didn't know all of them. 2 of them, by the way, were actually murdered by the Nazis. One of them was a holder of the Iron Cross for valor in the service of Germany in the First World War. Yeah. So my Uncle Albert, along with his younger brother Herman, took over their grandfather's business. My Uncle Albert married a woman, Henrietta Simpson, she had a lot of connections with the Dutch government, which is what saved them. So after Hitler came to power, they moved to Holland, and they had 3 daughters, all of whom all of them went into hiding, so I'm going to tell you their story. One of their daughters stayed in Holland, one emigrated to Palestine, and one came to the United States. She was my mother's closest relative. So this is cool. One of the daughters married a man who wrote a book called The Miracle of Survival, and this is the story of their families. They were hidden in a house in Holland, and this is, I think, just amazing. The family that hid them had the business on the lower level, and they lived upstairs, but you can kind of see where the arrow is there, where so they had 2 buildings side by side, but there was a space between them, an attic space, and that's where they hid. Yeah, and the Nazis did not find them. The family that saved them were called the Van der Zees, and they lived in these 2 attached homes. They were very active in the Dutch underground, hiding Jews, providing supplies, creating false papers, sabotaging whenever they could. And Mr. Van der Zee hated the Germans. And in an interview subsequently, He said he was motivated by his religion. He was not Jewish. By his religion and his hatred of the Germans and what they did to his country. So they survived. And here you can see this very old-fashioned, remember this is a long time ago, stove, and then there was like a tapestry behind them. The only entrance to that attic space was behind there. They had several close calls, but the Nazis never found them. So after the war, they emigrated to the United States, and that aunt and uncle had 2 boys, both of whom became physicians. The family that hid them, the Van der Zees, have been honored at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and Israel, among righteous Gentiles among nations, because they saved Jews that they also didn't know before this period of time, and my aunt and uncle were able to go there. And when I was a kid growing up, I remember that in the summers they would take their kids and they would go visit them while they were still alive in Holland. And then the other Gumbrich boy I just want to highlight quickly is my Uncle Herman. He and his wife Martha emigrated to Canada. Okay, so they were still in Germany during Kristallnacht, and this I have heard now from personal testimony. Their daughter told me this story, that they were in their house in Germany on Kristallnacht. The Nazis burst in, they tore everything up, they stole anything of value. And they were very, very frightened, as you can imagine, and they knew they had to get out. The only way they knew was to try to cross the border into the Netherlands, into Holland, where his brother was, and hopefully he could find them some form of refuge, which they did. So the area of Germany where they lived, Westphalia, is like right next door. So going to Holland was like a 40-mile drive, basically. And so when of course they weren't legal in the Netherlands. They were aliens, but they were given refuge in these refugee camps. They were in a city called Utrecht. Now in these refugee camps, it's terrible conditions, but the children still went to school, and my Aunt Selma, another Aunt Selma, told me about what that was like. And after Germany invaded the Netherlands, there was no place for them to go because they were illegal. At about this time, Canada opened up, made available 5,000 visas for Jews who were willing to come to Canada and farm the land. Now, my Uncle Herman and my Aunt Martha had never farmed any land. But of course, they immediately says, and they had 4 children. And indeed, they got visas to go to Winnipeg, Canada, and farm the land. They had no idea, of course, as you can imagine, what to expect. So they sailed across the ocean, and then they landed in, I think, St. John's in Canada, and then they had to take a train to Winnipeg. And my aunt was telling me how she was just a little child at that point in time, and the train ride itself was like 4 days, right? In Europe, you can't be on a train for 4 days without ending up in the ocean, right? So this was like, where are you taking us? So they ended up in Winnipeg, and they got their plot of land, and there were other German Jews there as well. So there was a whole community, and they learned to farm, and all was well. That farm, until just a few years ago, was in the family's hands. The older brother continued to farm the land until his death. My Aunt Selma just turned 100. I got the longevity genes, I hope. But anyway, yeah, and so she's told me stories that I didn't know before, which were very meaningful for me. So that's how they got out. So it's sort of a smorgasbord of different ideas and ways that people got out. This is the family. We have no idea who the person in the middle is, but that's my Uncle Herman and my Aunt Martha. I remember visiting them. Of course, when I made this slide, she turned 95, but that was 5 years ago. Do the math. So 3 of their children are still alive. They all live in Canada, and my Aunt Selma has 2 daughters. I'm the oldest of that generation, the next generation. And oddly, also the only one who speaks German. I learned to speak it as a child. So, yeah, so most of them still live in Canada. So to conclude then, I did good, right? Yeah. Time constraint. Back to the original picture. Survival in the midst of all this death and horror. And basically it's because of the kindness. I mean, kindness is almost too mild a word to use, in my opinion, because think of what these people risked. You know, in the case of the people who offered financial support, it was a financial thing, but the people who hid Jews, especially in Holland, they risked their lives. You know, in many cases, for people they didn't know. It's just extraordinary bravery, in my opinion. And so this exodus, this is just my family, where they went. U.S., Canada, Trinidad. I had relatives who went to Trinidad, Argentina, the Netherlands, South Africa, Palestine, and I had one uncle who came out of Germany through Shanghai. Shanghai was known as an open city. You did not need a visa. You did need money, however, because you had to get there. And yeah, so wherever they could go, whoever would take them, that is where they went. And this diaspora it's really hard, I think, to conceive of. So a couple of years ago, when my husband and I were in Germany, we visited a Holocaust museum in Berlin that was designed by Daniel Libeskind, who designed the Freedom Tower. And he's very creative in his museums. And in this museum, there is a space called the Garden of the Exiles. And Liebeskind's idea was to make you feel what it was like to be in a strange place, in a strange country. You were safe, right? I mean, they were safe. They knew nobody was going to break into their house at night. But it's still not entirely comfortable. You know, you're just in a really different place. And I just found this such a brilliant design. So what, you walk out into the space, and it's open to the sky, you can see the sky. And there are 49 concrete columns. And you can wander, it's like a maze. You can wander amongst the columns, and there's pebbles between them, but the ground is uneven. So when you walk through this space, you know you're safe, and you can see the sky, but you just don't feel comfortable, because you're like in a maze. You can't see your way out. And as you walk, you know, you're also kind of watching where you're walking all the time. And to me, this was very meaningful because it made me realize what it must have been like, you know, for my parents, especially coming in the late 1930s, and, you know, not speaking, they spoke a little English, but not being fluent in English, and being very obviously German. How difficult that might have been, but they took the chance, they integrated, and the rest is history. So, thank you for your time.
Okay, this is where we can ask some questions. So does anyone have questions?
How long were her aunt and uncle in the attic as well?
How long were your aunt and uncle in the attic?
They were a long time. Let me see, I think probably from 39 to liberation. A long time, very, very long time. One of my, I'm calling my uncle, but you know, one of the girls happened to be his brother couldn't stand it, and he was killed. So, yeah. I mean, some people were a short time, some people were a long time. So you had a question?
The sponsor from the United States?
Yeah.
I noticed it showed how much you made, how much you had in the bank. Did they have to put money up?
Yes. Question was whether the sponsor had to put money up. Yes, they did.
So they had to have cash and put it up?
Yes.
Do you know how much that was?
No.
I was just curious.
I mean, and of course it's not today's dollars.
Well, I know.
Maybe I'll use my teacher voice.
I'll walk fast too.
Walking fast is in my past.
I'm reading a book right now about the 1930s, and it's about the family that came over. He was the American ambassador, and about how he sent letters back to the United States State Department, all kinds of things. And I guess back in the 30s you would have called it political correctness or whatever. Basically, it was anti-Semitism.
Right on, that was
From the
anti-Semitism.
very top, from Roosevelt and his advisors.
Yep.
I wonder, has anybody ever thought how many Jewish people, and others too, but mostly Jews, lost their lives because of him turning a cold shoulder to all those people? And it wasn't just him. A lot of the people in this country were anti-Semites. And I think sometimes to this very day, you feel it or you see it around a little bit. What do you think, anyone on that?
I'm just going to walk to the middle. Okay, that's what you
So if you're sleeping, that's the time to wake up. I am so grateful to you for bringing this up, because what you said is absolutely correct. And I would recommend that you watch the latest Ken Burns special. I know some people are shaking their heads. It's called The U.S. and the Holocaust. It's, I think it was shown in 2 parts. It's not as long as most of the Ken Burns specials, but it highlights many, many, many of these very things that you talked about. And in fact, I had just recommended to your president a book called The Resistance Women, and one of them was the ambassador's daughter. And the women, because again, Hitler thought they weren't good for much, worked as couriers. And they really helped with the Allied war effort because they carried information about things like German troop movements and whatever they could observe, you know, and where they were surprised, etc. But what you say is absolutely correct. And in the Ken Burns special, he actually shows you the documentation of, and several people, so there was resistance of many forms, right? And one form of resistance, there were people who took photographs of the ghettos and the camps. They were snuck out, again, people who risked their lives to do that. And there were people who snuck out documentation that made its way to the United States, but no one.
Eisenhower made a big deal out of making sure that the news people and the local residents went into those camps, because he said the day is going to come when people are going to deny that any of this happened.
Yes.
And that day is right now. There's a lot of people in this world that are going around trying to deny that the Holocaust ever happened.
And that's an iconic photograph of Eisenhower, and he forced the townspeople who claimed that they had no idea what was going on. And many of our survivors actually have provided testimony that when you smell human flesh burning, that doesn't smell like anything else. It doesn't smell like burning trash. It's hard to believe that they didn't know. They chose not to know, I think. And so that, again, absolutely right on. Unfortunately, many of our students don't recognize Dwight Eisenhower, but we tell them, so that they have a good sense.
Yeah, you mentioned the Kinder transport. You know, that happened before Poland fell.
Yes.
And what's interesting is the United States was contacted, would they take 2,000 survivors, children, and they refused. And England took a lot of them. In fact, at one of the Holocaust museums, there was a woman who used to speak that was actually a Kinder transport kid.
Eddie Epstein. She's one
Yes.
of ours.
Is she still there?
No.
Is her story there?
Yes.
Because I had wanted to meet her so badly, and every time I go, she was in Europe. Yes.
Yeah.
So was any of your family in any of the camps, in the Nazi camps?
No.
Praise the Lord.
Well, I mean, the ones who were killed must have killed, but I haven't looked up their, the history. The Nazis kept pretty good records. So the Red Cross has been very helpful for many of the survivors to help them locate what happened to their families. Because pretty much the Nazis, they would record, when the people came to the camps and what their work assignment was, and then they would record when they died. And it was always something other than that they were murdered, of course. They died of intestinal disease, they died of a heart attack. But it doesn't have the exact dates that those things happened.
One more question, if anyone has, I see 2 more hands. We'll do 2 more.
In Germany today, it's against the law to deny the Holocaust, which I think is very well. And do you have oral histories of your family?
I do. The question was whether I have oral histories, and
So in Germany, not all Holocaust education is required, right? So German children go to the concentration camps, they have to learn about it. So it's sort of an interesting thing. Many of my Jewish friends that I grew up with in New York City, I bet you couldn't tell that I'm from New York. There's no accent there, yes. They won't even go to Germany. And I've been there, I'm going in 2 months for my 4th trip. Germany has really tried to reconcile and make a way, make amends. And interestingly, I'll tell you, maybe you didn't know this, one of the things that Hitler promised to do in the Nazi Party platform was to create a system of pensions for retirees, like Social Security. And he delivered on that. And in a lovely twist of fate, my mother collected Social Security from Germany until the day she died at the age of 96.
Thank you. I'm going to make this short. St. Patty's Day from Scotch Irish. I'm half German, and I really couldn't deny the German part of it, of my ancestry, because as a young child, I saw on the TV, what was occurring, and I could not believe how one human could do that to another human. So I just want to make a couple of comments. Somebody may have made it. What was it, the ship that had 1,200 people?
the SS St. Louis.
They were turned away.
Yes.
They were turned away. They were there.
And they were
went back.
legitimate.
Went back
People
to
on
their-
that ship had papers.
Yeah. Lindbergh, important St. Louis, anti-Semitic. Henry Ford, anti-Semitic. And the other comment I want to make is this. Martin Luther, anti-Semitic. That goes back a long way. So this was supported by the church, but my comment to us all is, this did not come out of Hitler. This came out of jokes and comments and attitudes and religion and just a little bit that's smothered and was part of the culture, but that's okay. And one day it blew up in the face, and you're saying, how can a Christian, how can an educated, how can an industrial nation do this?
God bless you for your comments. Please share your wisdom and your knowledge with young people. I don't know that they need to know, because it seems so easy.